Okay, as I was saying, for those that they don't know me, my name is Kostas Zanos. I'm the Vice President and Program Chair of Hellenic West. Welcome to our lecture program. This is the last lecture of the season. We don't have lectures in the summer because people, they go on vacation. Many, they go to Greece. And then we start again in October. So we are looking forward to see you back in October. Before introducing the speaker, I would like to express the thanks and appreciation to Saradi Alexopoulos for his very kind offer to us the cookies and the coffee for the lecture. Thank you very much. This is in honor and in the memory of his grandmother. Her name was Irini, and she was from Smyrna.
Iphigenia,
I'm sorry. Iphigenia,
born and bred inside Smyrna.
Very good.
And her mother's cousin was Archbishop Chrysostom.
Oh, I see. Oh, that's very interesting. Very good. Very good. Our lecture this afternoon is Professor Tusan. She's Professor of History at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, where she writes and teaches about human rights, genocide, and the history of war. She received her doctoral degree from the University of California at Berkeley, and before joining the University of Nevada at Las Vegas, she was a fellow in the humanities at Stanford University in California.
Oh, cool.
She's the author of 3 books. The first one, The British Empire and the Armenian Genocide, Humanitarianism and Imperial Politics from Gladstone to Churchill. The second book, Smyrna's Ashes, Humanitarianism, Genocide, and the Birth of the Middle East. And the latest book is The Last Treaty, the Middle Eastern Front at the End of the First World War. She has published many articles in journals, like the Journal of the American Historical Review, the Journal of Modern History, and the Journal Past and Present. And she is the current president of the Professional Society of North American Conference on British Studies. Professor Tusan, please.
Okay, I'll keep this moving so this doesn't go out. Can you hear me in the back? Is this okay, this level? Okay, let me know if you can't hear me. Just give me a thumbs down or wave at me. Great. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. This talk is I hope you enjoyed the talk today, and we'll have time for questions at the end. So I'm going to read my talk. I'll give you my narrative. There'll be lots of images, so pay attention to both. The last fire smoldered in Smyrna in late September 1922. 300,000 refugees left homeless sat on the pier under the watchful eye of the Turkish military, waiting for Allied transport ships that would take them away from the city burned to the ground by Turkish nationalists. A shout went up. Long live Mustafa Kemal Pasha, long live. Garabed Hacharian remembered thinking as he joined in the cry, quote, yes, long live Mustafa Kemal Pasha. We will forever be grateful to him for what he has done. After butchering thousands of Christians, after robbing and ruining this rich city, he has subjected hundreds of thousands of people to an untold misery. Yes, long may he live. The burning of Smyrna in September 1922 marked a final chapter in the genocidal policy of Turkish nationalists against Christian minority communities in the Ottoman Empire. It would lead to the end of the First World War after the signing of the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923. Its results were far-reaching and stretched beyond the 1922 moment. Out of the ashes of Smyrna came a new city, Izmir, and a new Turkish nation that erased any sign of its multi-religious and multi-ethnic past. Here's the area. You can see Smyrna here in, of course, in orange. Here's a bigger map, of course, we're talking about today, the area we're talking about today. My talk today considers the events of Smyrna as part of the forgotten story of the end of the First World War. I argue in my most recent book, The Last Treaty, that events like Smyrna were crucial to understanding the end of the First World War. Most historians claim that World War I ended with the Treaty of Versailles, signed between Germany and the Allies in 1919. But war continued for 4 long years between the Allies and the Ottoman Empire after the signing of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. Only with the signing of the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923 did the First World War truly end. So why does Smyrna matter to this story? The Treaty of Lausanne, signed 100 years ago last July, was the result of humanitarian and military disaster at Smyrna. The treaty paved the way for a modern internationalism that rejected empire in favor of the principles of state sovereignty. This shift politicized the treatment of minorities who found themselves on the wrong side of the new national borders. The violent reality of the Lausanne precedent had far-reaching implications for population transfers beyond even the Second World War. Greece would be most affected by this process after the First World War. By the mid-1920s, nearly 1/4 of Greece's population held refugee status because the Lausanne Treaty mandated that Turks living in Greece and Greeks living in Turkey switch places. It's time for historians to take the last treaty seriously as the final chapter of the First World War and the beginning of new post-war realities that change the way the world thinks about humanitarian crisis, refugees, and multilateral international agreements. So first, some background on the First World War. I'll be saying First World War, World War I. The conflict that most of us know started in 1914 and ended in 1919. My argument is that the war goes on much longer. The end of World War I is really the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923 is my argument. Historians typically focus on World War I in Western Europe, that war that began in 1914, the war in France, the war in Belgium. That's usually, when we talk about First World War, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about France. But this was truly a world war that engulfed Asia, Russia, Africa, and the Middle East. The Middle Eastern Front is a term that I deploy to describe the war in the Ottoman Empire. Oh, these arrows. Huh?
Is that where you want to be, right there?
All right. Sorry, I'm getting used to the new setup here. So the Middle Eastern Front, my map here, these are the fronts of World War I. I don't know if you can see them, but this is the front we usually talk about when we're talking about World War I, the Western Front. I want to talk about what's happening here. And I'm calling this area, what's happening in the Ottoman Empire here, the Middle Eastern Front. And it's really something most historians ignore. They don't talk about that part of the world when we talk about World War I. So my focus in talking about the Lausanne Treaty is how the war here gets resolved. And I think Smyrna is crucial to that story. So when I talk about the Middle Eastern Front, I'm really talking about the battles that are happening in this area here today. I deploy this term, the Middle Eastern Front, to describe the war in the Ottoman territory in the Eastern Mediterranean that included the struggle for what was then called Mesopotamia, as well as North Africa and Anatolia, or what we would call Asia Minor there. So when I'm talking about the Ottoman Empire today, I might slip between Turkey and the Ottoman Empire, because in this period, the Ottoman Empire is transitioning to the nation state of Turkey. So I'm going to talk, the Ottoman Empire is still in existence. That's who fights World War I. But Turkey is the successor state to the Ottoman Empire. The war on the Middle Eastern front paralleled the war fought in Europe and the Balkans between the Central Powers led by the Austro-Hungarian empires, and the Allies led by the British, the French, the Russians, and the Americans. What I'm calling the Long War between the Allies and the Ottoman Empire had devastating consequences for civilian populations caught up in its wake. I started researching Smyrna over a decade ago. This part of my talk uses the eyewitness accounts I've gathered in my research in US and British archives to describe the destruction of the city. And these are included in my earlier book, Smyrna's Ashes. You'll hear today the voices of sailors who were there at Smyrna in September 1922 and see the photographs that they took while stationed in the harbor over 100 years ago. You'll also see some US naval footage taken to describe the scene to American audiences at home. The documentary evidence shows how far Kemal was willing to go to rid the Ottoman Empire of its minority Christian population. The fire and the massacres that happened in its wake also revealed a historically inadequate response of the West to state-sponsored terror in the Eastern Mediterranean. Simply put, what happened in Smyrna matters to the history of the First World War and the Armenian genocide. After telling you the story of Smyrna through the eyes of those who were there, I will conclude by placing this history in the geopolitical context of the Lausanne Treaty. Howes and Swinley, two quotes that you see up here, these were sailors, British sailors, and they were there at Smyrna in the harbor, along with hundreds of other military men in September 1922. They witnessed together the final chapter of the First World War in the East unfold with the destruction of the Ottoman Empire's key commercial Mediterranean port city, along with its entire population of non-Muslim inhabitants. And I'll read you these two quotes. And C.J. Howes, one of the chief petty officers, says, "I wonder how many Britishers were at the evacuation of Smyrna. If there were any, they will hear me out in any statement set below, and having emerged safely from that hell, make them realize whether this was a horrible nightmare or a reality when we arrived on Sunday, September 3rd, 1922. Lieutenant Swinley puts it more succinctly. When he saw what was happening in Smyrna, he said, civilization in 1922 is a mockery. Another sailor remembered, quote, "It was not long after our stay in Constantinople with our fleet that we had a sudden call to sail to Smyrna, where the Turks were raiding and devastating the city. The carnage and the cruelty to the Greek civilians was indescribable. We saw from where we were just off the shore the Turks bayoneting bodies, men, women, and children through the windows of their homes. Hundreds of Greek civilians, as well as troops hanging over the dock waterside, and the Turkish soldiers coming along and deliberately severing the victims' arms, resulting in hundreds of bodies falling to their death in the sea." Another sailor reported on September 13th, quote, "Fire has broken out in the Armenian quarter of the town, aided by strong wind, is spreading rapidly." These are some images of the port that you saw on that first slide, burning on September 13th. The next one is yes. So this is a video that was taken by the US Navy of what was happening in Smyrna, and the intertitles that you see is an explanation for American audiences for why the US is there in this region. So it was meant for consumption by American audiences, and this is actual footage of the city burning from the U.S. naval footage.
Looks like Gaza.
Yeah. And you can see the flag there, the U.S. flag there, boats. The fire spread westwards after September 13th to the Greek and European quarters, making it to the American settlement of Paradise, leaving only the Turkish quarter untouched. C.J. Howes wrote, "The stench of human flesh burning was appalling, and the streets were stacked with dead men, women, children, and dogs." His commander concluded the spectacle was magnificently terrible. Within a matter of days, one of the empire's most cosmopolitan and diversities had disappeared from the map. Here's what the pier looked like after fire. The men who watched the destruction of Smyrna from their ships moored in the harbor could do little to stop the slaughter. While life got back to normal in Europe after the signing of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, Smyrna offered a tragic reminder that the First World War continued in the East. Here on the Smyrna pier, civilians and military men witnessed the Ottoman Empire's final solution to the so-called minority problem. The Allies' ill-conceived response to the rising tide of Turkish nationalism during the war, coupled with a wait-and-see attitude to the events at Smyrna, exacerbated the humanitarian crisis unfolding there in September 1922. Eventually, many did take turns as heroes by participating in rescue. This helped ease the suffering of civilian victims while revealing other uncomfortable truths about the reality of total war on the Middle Eastern front. The international crises of the 1920s that would displace over 1 million Greek, Armenian, Assyrian, and European inhabitants of the Ottoman Empire put in sharp relief the inability of the West to respond to genocidal nationalism that had started in the midst of World War. This is the British ship, the Iron Duke, in the harbor. Here's another angle of it. Allied ships called to the Smyrna harbor in early September included American, French, Italian, and British destroyers, battleships, and aid vessels with strict orders of neutrality. Our duty is to watch the pier and landing places for refugees, and if British, to bring them off, one sailor reported in his diary. The British consul at Smyrna requested that evacuation ships be sent as soon as word of the Greek defeat at the hands of Turkish nationalists reached him. Greece had occupied Smyrna, the area around Smyrna, since 1919, that orange area that I showed you in that first map. Reports of Greek atrocities against Muslim subjects during the occupation fueled an already tense post-war situation made worse when victorious Turkish nationalist forces replaced the retreating Greek army in 1922. Mustafa Kemal fully controlled the city by early September. The inability of the Greek army to defend the town from invasion, according to a British Foreign Office telegram, prompted orders for the, quote, evacuation of the British colony at Smyrna on September 2nd. It proposed the complete evacuation of Asia Minor the next day and concluded, quote, His Majesty's government are anxious to terminate disastrous warfare and to avoid further shedding of blood, and will gladly take any steps in conjunction with their allies to secure these objects. The British government would also consider political conditions under which an evacuation would take place, which included, quote, the protection of Christian populations. By early September, however, plans had only been made to evacuate British nationals whom the government provided with food for the voyage, but no accommodation upon arrival in either Malta or Cyprus. When the Iron Duke arrived on September 4th, this is the Iron Duke here, it was charged with collecting approximately 1,200 refugees from 4 designated locations on the coast. This is the evacuation order from the British archives that indicating that only British citizens would be evacuated. So by early September, it was an evacuation, but only of nationals that were associated with these particular ships. And this is what, if you were in Smyrna in early 1922 in September, you would have read this and known that it included this 1,200 person group. Heavily armed soldiers in khaki fighting kit and shrapnel helmets would help ensure the prevention of any but British subjects from embarking. So they were going to enforce this order pretty seriously. The order of strict neutrality excluded assisting or taking on any British nationals on board. This placed military men in the unconscionable position of having to turn away desperate civilians marked for elimination by Turkish nationalists. These are the European nationals on board the ship, right as the fire started. These are the Smyrna residents who are waiting and hoping to be evacuated at that same moment. Even before the fire started, the sailors who arrived in Smyrna in early September realized that this would not be a routine evacuation. The presence of regular Turkish cavalry and armed irregulars called Chets increased the tension among an already nervous populace in a place where Greeks, Armenians, and Europeans historically had made up the majority of the population. Here's an image of the Chets on the pier. Here's another one taken from above. Anxious residents already had filled the harbor when the first British ships arrived. The HMS Tribune watched the scene from its mooring on the Custom House wharf. Ferry boats, as one sailor recalled, here's one of the ferry boats. Ferry boats crowded with terrified Greeks, one passenger not understanding our neutrality and evidently disappointed at us taking no action, shouted out as the ferry passed, quote, "Thank you very much, kill us like lot chickens." This was accompanied by a suggestive motion of drawing the hand across the throat, end quote. This comic gesture found its tragic counterpoint on the scene on the shore where crews witnessed a series of brutal murders in broad daylight. Now, many suspected that the violence would get worse, but few anticipated that the nationalist army would set fire to the city deliberately. Eyewitnesses reported seeing Turkish soldiers deliberately starting the fires that would leave the city in ruins. Numerous other sources corroborated this. Howes, earlier sailor, recorded the fate of refugees who had taken cover in an Armenian church. Quote, "An American eyewitness declared that the regular Turks set fire to the church and then surrounded it." Members of the Smyrna Fire Brigade testified in a trial against the Guardian Assurance Company after the war that they witnessed barrels of petroleum unloaded by Turkish soldiers and purposefully set ablaze. By September 14th, arson had spread to the port offices. Quote, "Eyewitnesses from the HMF Cardiff state that these offices were deliberately set on fire by Turkish soldiers who were going round the buildings with torches," reported one sailor who believed that the fires had been set, quote, "to cover up traces of more massacred Armenians." Here is an image of Smyrna ablaze. 9. In the days preceding the fire, British, American, and Italian ships remained fully occupied, evacuating their own nationals. Most of us of my vintage were used to evacuations, Captain Swinley recalled. Disturbing signs, however, suggested that this evacuation would be different. At noon, a dead body appeared in an upright position and floated to the ship's side, where it remained owing to the direction of the wind. A second body appeared an hour later, and as there was no prospect of these floating away, they were weighted and sank. Those refugees who made it to the ship alive fared little better. At 23:30, a man was seen swimming towards the ship. He hailed us with, "I am a Greek officer." We were unable to assist him, but he clung to our cable for an hour and a half, eventually swimming off, and we hope succeeded in reaching the shore again. As one sailor remembered in an oral interview after the war, it was a very muddled evacuation. The outbreak of the fire added to the confusion, driving an estimated 500,000 refugees to the 2-mile-long Smyrna pier. A day after the fire devastated the Armenian and Greek quarters of the city, sailors reported that, quote, "scores of people were swimming around the ships imploring to be saved, some of them holding the ship's side after we had got underway." Suddenly, on September 14th, a signal was made by the commander-in-chief, "Away all boats," and the mission transformed into a rescue effort. There are rescue boats, here are rescue boats from an American ship stationed in the harbor. You can see the American flag in the bow of one of the boats. Although the original order has disappeared, and believe me, I've tried to find it, observers tell a story of a chaotic rescue mission executed in response to the fires rather than official orders from London. When the British admiral ordered the evacuation of all in need, he did so arguing, quote, "that the agreement not to take any refugees on board British ships could no longer be binding," after what they had witnessed for 2 weeks in the harbor. They said, we can't just sit and watch this anymore. The son of reservist Duncan Wallace remembered his father saying, the situation was obviously horrifying for the crews and those in command of British ships, particularly in light of our own country's political and moral responsibility for what was happening in Smyrna. These are refugees on board a dreadnought turned rescue ship. Wallace, a resident of Smyrna, implored the admiral to abandon the policy of strict neutrality. Whether or not assisted by press or diplomatic reports, which were probably now reaching Allied governments in developing events, Wallace recalled, the orders were at last changed, and British ships were authorized to take off refugees of all nationalities who were in danger. Soon after, the admiral gave Wallace a small landing party to evacuate a makeshift hospital. The coordination of this effort extended beyond the military. The Board of Trade organized transportation for evacuees to suitable destinations where supplies would be available. Wallace's own family disembarked in Alexandria, quote, as penniless refugees. The humanitarian crisis caused by the fire turned the dozens of Allied ships in the harbor from observers into participants. Here are the Navy men evacuating the wounded. For many victims, however, the rescue effort came too late. A sailor on one of the ships moored on the dock described the scene. Thousands must have been saved by the fleet owing to the roaring of the fire, the cries of the people, and the crashing of falling beams. Rescue work has been very difficult. A horse caught fire and galloped madly into the crowd. Its end was not seen. The ship's decks heaved with refugees who later disembarked on a nearby island. The uncoordinated Allied response made attempts at rescue inadequate at best. There are still a large number of refugees ashore, and the French and Italians are continuing the embarkation of their subjects. We still need a reminder of what has taken place, one sailor recalled. We get it in the corpses that constantly float past the ship. Men, women, and children drift past, and we are thankful they do not hang around the ship as they did when we were secured to the wall. The task of evacuating 500,000 refugees overwhelmed an ill-equipped force initially sent to evacuate 1,200 of their own nationals. Howes recalled, as hard as our boats and sailors worked during the night in rescues, we didn't seem to make much of an impression in diminishing the crowd. Old women of 80 and upwards had all the household goods they had managed to rescue on their humped backs. Cripples were staggering along the burning beach and were dropping on the way. Skeletons and remains of crutches testified to their fate. Quote. In the absence of a coordinated effort by Allied governments, the humanitarian mission faltered. This had important political implications that would force the Allies' hand in renegotiating the treaty between the Allies and the Ottoman Empire. They had made a treaty in 1920, the Treaty of Sèvres, but it was never enforced. This action in 1922 forces the Allies to realize that they absolutely must renegotiate the treaty or the war will not end. As the Allies struggled to gain control of the refugee situation, Mustafa Kemal's hold on the city tightened. Kemal informed the Allies that all evacuations would cease on October 1st. One newspaper reported, quote, no reply has been given to the request made to the Turks for an extension of time, but the work was still proceeding and not stopped on September 30th, as threatened by the Turkish authorities. Greek ships under American control and British ships evacuated refugees of all nationalities. Most of the evacuations took place in the 3-day period at the end of September. So people had waited weeks in these terrible conditions. Having completely cleared the town of Greeks and Armenians, one official wrote, the Turks claimed to have solved the problem of minorities. Large numbers left by sea, but many thousands of males, especially, have been marched into the interior. Here's an image of the movements of the refugees on shore. Here's another segment from that same video. These are refugees being evacuated and moving. This is from that U.S. naval video. The problem of minorities, as it was called by the Allies, continued. Lieutenant Swinley described the scene of the rushed evacuation under Kemalist dictates from his post on the HMS Curacao in late September, and I'll give you a long quote here from Swinley. The town appeared quiet, except for smoke rising from two smoldering fires. On the 26th of September, the evacuation commenced. Every available hand in the ship was landed, and arrangements were made for dealing with the baggage and were sorted out by the Turkish guard, who kept back men of military age. Many of these unfortunate refugees, chiefly Greeks and Armenians, were in a pitiable state, and several died on board or fell exhausted on reaching the gangways. Families became separated, and the shrieking and crying of women and children whose husbands and fathers had been seized by the Turks at the barriers was truly pitiful. Each ship was crammed, and there was hardly room to move on deck. Here is an image of the refugees being put on board, some lifted here on gurneys. After 4.5 days of loading rescue ships, Swinley recalled that the flow suddenly ceased, and we learned that the evacuation, to all intents and purposes, was finished. Those who made it on board were taken to the Greek island of Lesbos, where men of military age were separated from their families or deported into the interior, where many were killed or died of exposure or starvation. Rescue ships evacuated approximately 30,000 people per day, though according to the Foreign Office, it was impossible to give exact figures. By the end of September, there was no apparent diminution in the numbers clamoring for admission to the embarkation jetty. The Allied position continued to deteriorate in October and November, though one official reported, quote, "While openly rejoicing in the disappearance of Armenians and the departure of the Greeks, certain Turkish officials continued to deplore the absence of the British in their capital." Conditions in Smyrna, however, suggested that the British might not be welcome either. The acting vice consul reported that along with the Greek churches being systematically razed to the ground, that the British cemetery had been entered and the graves defiled. He concluded, it is becoming increasingly clear that the military are out of hand. Confrontation with Kamala's forces over the civilian evacuations made it clear that peace on the Middle Eastern front hinged on letting the Turkish nationalists resolve the minority question their way. Within a matter of months, the Allies were forced back to the table to renegotiate the ill-fated 1920 Treaty of Sèvres that represented the first attempt at peace with the Ottoman Empire and had contained strong protections for Christian minorities. The strained but absent-minded arguments of the Lausanne Conference that starts in 1922 in November ultimately forced the revision of the Treaty of Sèvres, and it led to a new treaty, the Treaty of Lausanne, that weakened minority protection provisions. So it was a very different kind of treaty than Sèvres when it came to the question of protection for minorities. Nationalists, Turkish nationalists, considered the signing of the Lausanne Treaty in July of 1923 the greatest diplomatic victory in Turkish history. In the end, the haphazard humanitarian relief effort weakened the effect of the Allied military victory over the Central Powers, which included the Ottoman Empire, while doing little to stem the chaos of the refugee crisis. It's easy to forget that the Allies actually won this war. When you hear this episode, it does not feel like a victory in the same way as if you stop at 1919. And that's one of my arguments, is we have to see the war until 1923, because it doesn't look like a full-fledged Allied victory if you look at what happens in 1922 and 1923. The total devastation of Smyrna and fumbled evacuation indicated that the price of protecting minorities would be continuing a war that the Allies no longer wanted to fight. As C.J. Howes concluded his chronicle of his days at Smyrna, although the British Navy landed with arms but did not fire and so plunged England into the war, they controlled themselves whilst these atrocities were committed all around them. The atrocities offered another sailor a very different lesson. As he left Smyrna, he wrote in his journal that it would, quote, be a long time before we forget the experiences of the last few days. And above everything else, we are thankful that we were not born Armenians. Here are slides of refugees awaiting their fate in Smyrna in September. Okay, so what can we take from the story that I've been telling you about Smyrna? What does it mean? So I'm going to make 3 general points. As I've already suggested, Smyrna represented a key moment in forcing the Allies to renegotiate the 1920 Treaty of Sèvres, which was supposed to have ended the war between the Allies and the Ottoman Empire, but didn't. The burning of Smyrna gave the Turks the upper hand in the Treaty of Lausanne negotiations. Second, Smyrna's refugee crisis changed how the international community would deal with refugees in the future. Finally, I'll conclude by explaining the lasting significance of the Lausanne Treaty for us today. So let's talk about the making of that Lausanne Treaty as a result of this event. Less than 2 months after the fires died out at Smyrna, the Allies were back at the negotiating table, ready to make concessions for peace by revising the Treaty of Sèvres. The new agreement, the Treaty of Lausanne, reflected a new reality. Though Turkey had shared the defeat of the Central Powers, the nationalists had never ceased fighting, one commentator observed. In peace conferences, there should be a victor and a vanquished, but at Lausanne, the vanquished had become victorious. The powerful position of the newly legitimated Kemalist government after the burning of Smyrna meant that the Allies occupied a much weaker position than at any time after the 1918 armistice. They agreed to stop fighting in 1918. It's the first armistice. They signed the armistice before the armistice is signed with Turkey, right? It's the very first one, October 1918. But they are fighting for 4 more years after that. They can't end this war. 7 months of negotiations at Lausanne resulted in the revision of the entire Sèvres Treaty, including the protection of minorities section, Allied occupation of Constantinople, and the freedom of the Straits question. On the eve of the opening of the Lausanne Conference, one newspaper headline summed up the Allied position, quote, "Constantinople must not be allowed to be a second Smyrna." Kemal's tactic of burning the city had worked. People were terrified that he would burn Constantinople too. Britain, France, and Italy refused to help Greece fight Kemal, who was now firmly in charge of the former Ottoman government. The 2 sessions of the Lausanne Conference stumbled toward peace. The Treaty of Lausanne took its final form in the 2nd session as an agreement that Allied diplomats found a bitter pill to swallow. Turkey, the British Lausanne delegation believed, remained ready to fight rather than submit to any interference in internal affairs. Between the 2 sessions of the Lausanne Conference, the Greek army had regained strength and threatened to launch a major offensive against Kemal. Combination of instability in the Greek government, Venizelos government, brought on by the massive influx of refugees and a lack of support after the pro-Greek British Prime Minister Lloyd George was forced out of office in 1922, meant that that threat never materialized. The Greek army was never able to launch its challenge. But as tensions mounted, the desire to broker peace with Kemal at any cost, or almost any cost, grew. In place of the Treaty of Sèvres came the Treaty of Lausanne, negotiated in the immediate aftermath of Smyrna. The minority question loomed large at the conference. And here's an image of the Turkish delegation at the Lausanne. The treaty enacted the first compulsory exchange between Greek and Muslim civilians and codified the idea of forced removal as a tool of minority protection into international law. Forced removal for the first time of minorities is codified in Lausanne. It had not happened before. Before it had been voluntary, any sort of exchange. But now we have the principle that international law, you can make minorities change places. And that is a huge precedent, an important precedent in Lausanne. So what Lausanne dictated was that 400,000 Greek Muslims would trade, they said, as they put it, trade places with 1.2 million Ottoman Christian minorities. The question of who came up with this idea of compulsory population exchange at Lausanne is not entirely clear. Greece sought what they called reciprocal immigration, while Turkey sought to, quote, recall millions of ethnic Turks into the Kemalist state. Forced movement of peoples would protect minorities, so the logic of population exchange went, by reconfiguring the composition of post-war states, making like, getting rid of the multi-ethnic, multi-religious states and making sure that, but as we know, minorities do not conform easily to two sides of borders. That's a fantasy, right? That you can even do that. But that was the logic of Lausanne. The massacres won't happen if like lives with like, right? There was a sinister side of this population exchange as well. While it seems idealized and we know that it didn't work, the context for it, I think, is really important. Why did the Allies embark on this, what looked like a crazy utopian idea that we would never have mixed populations? Well, Dr. Friedhof Nansen, he was the High Commissioner for Refugees. He addressed the Lausanne Conference in December of 1922, and he was in favor of population exchange. So he was the High Commissioner for Refugees, and he gets up there as the expert. So this is Nansen. I don't know if you've seen him before, Friedhof Nansen. He's also, if you've heard his name, it's probably been as a famous, I think he's a famous polar explorer. He was a Norwegian polar explorer who became this High Commissioner for Refugees. And there he is. These are Near East relief feeding tables. This is actually a postcard. So he became a very famous advocate for refugees. So the biggest advocate for refugees is saying, let's exchange populations. But the question is, why did he do it, right? His proposal to exchange populations came from his knowledge that the Turkish nationalist government, now under the leadership of Kemal, already planned to forcibly remove all remaining Ottoman Christians at the end of the war. In November 1922, Turkey's Lausanne delegates were given explicit instructions from the Turkish parliament to, quote, exchange all minorities as a condition of the peace. The idea for the exchange thus started with the Turkish delegation's dictate to remove all new non-Muslims from the new Turkish state, and basically a threat saying, if you don't do it, we're going to do it our way. Both Allied and Turkish nationalist priorities shaped the end of the First World War. The Allies divided Mesopotamia between themselves, but Turkey also prevailed by eliminating religious minorities and preventing the partition of Anatolia, Asia Minor, which they reinvented as a Turkish homeland. Back to our post-war map. So this is the Turkish homeland, right? The Ottoman Empire used to extend all the way down into what is we know today as the Middle East. But this border here, this is the border. These are the borders that are set with the Treaty of Lausanne. And we're going to talk about these islands in a moment, the Aegean Islands between Greece. Smyrna also mattered because of its effects on refugees. How Lausanne categorized minorities according to religion had a lasting effect on refugee policy. So in the Sèvres treaties, they were considered minorities by ethnicity, Greeks, Armenians, Assyrians. In the Lausanne Treaty, it was divided between Muslim and non-Muslim. So it was by religion. So by designating that religious distinction, it really it hardened the lines between peoples who could live together. And I think that's really important. The over 1 million Greek, Armenian, and Assyrian refugees that flooded Greece from the Ottoman Empire served as a grim reminder of a continuing crisis. After Smyrna, Christian minorities, according to one observer, quote, became synonymous with the word refugee. Greece willingly took in all refugees exchanged with the Ottoman Empire as a condition of the Lausanne Treaty. And I think in 1925, they granted citizenship. But in that time, it means, as a consequence, nearly a quarter of Greece's population held refugee status, which is huge. And some of you may have seen these images before, the tents. Greece looked for help from Britain, France, and the United States, countries with strong ties to these new refugees. Britain accepted relatively few refugees itself and funded even fewer resettlement projects. The public, however, continued to give, and charities filled in some of the blanks, right? Private charities like Save the Children, still in existence today, and local organizations scrambled to fund projects that served the population of displaced civilians scattered outside the boundaries of the East. Described as a problem of colossal dimensions, not my phrase, it's theirs, the exchange commenced in January 1923. Armenians and Assyrians were a particularly difficult case since they belonged to no recognizable nation state and could not go back to their ancestral homes. The virtual elimination of the entire Christian population in Western Anatolia after Smyrna put pressure on the surrounding regions. In addition to the US and Greece, Armenians and Assyrians found their way to the British territories in Mesopotamia, settlements in Yerevan, and French-mandated territories in Syria. Strict immigration controls created much hardship and largely confined the settlement of refugees who stayed in the region to the area bordering the former Ottoman Empire. So, let's return to the refugees on the pier. On the ruins of this burned out city, a new Turkey was born. Remembering what happened here makes this history of nations and refugees visible again. As I hope my talk today has shown, the story of Smyrna is not the story of the Greek disaster or the Armenian disaster or the US disaster or the European disaster. It's a story that explains the painful transition from empire to nation after the It is by bearing witness that I think the story of the final days of Smyrna need to consider as part of a shared history that cannot be easily erased. Today, the issue is not about refugees, as it was when Lausanne was negotiated over 100 years ago, but territory and the treatment of minorities. Turkey has grumbled that it wants to renegotiate the Treaty of Lausanne. Conspiracy theories circulating in Turkey claim that the treaty has, quote, secret articles and thus makes it opening to questioning and rewriting. It doesn't, by the way. It is the only First World War treaty that is still in effect today, which is kind of remarkable. The issue centers around the Greek islands located in the Aegean Sea close to the Turkish coastline, as well as the treatment of minority Muslim communities in Greece and Christian populations in Turkey. Some worry that Erdogan's inflammatory rhetoric that began in 2016 is undermining the Lausanne Treaty's role in delineating borders and maintaining good relations between Turkey and Greece. Greece does not want to demilitarize the Eastern Aegean Islands because of the shadow of Cyprus and sees Turkish challenges as a threat to Greek sovereignty. Both sides are behaving as if Lausanne was a bilateral treaty rather than part of international law. Renegotiating any of the 143 articles and 17 conventions, protocols, and declarations ratified 100 years ago as the Treaty of Lausanne would require the consent of the international community. It was a treaty signed to end a disastrous world war. It should not be used as a pawn to achieve the expansionist ambitions of Turkey and threaten the balance of power in the region. That's it. You have questions? Do you want to take?
Thank you very much for this very excellent lecture.
The timing was, excuse me.
Oh, thank you.
Just not over. Act the questions.
Yeah. Don't worry. I will take care of the questions.
Okay.
So let me say the rules. Those who they have asked a question, they will wait. They want a second or a third. They will wait until others who they have not asked a question, but they have the opportunity to have one question. Other than that, we proceed. So I will take from this side to this side, so we have bottoms. Here.
Thank you, Dr. Tusan. Welcome to Chicago. Thank you for your presentation. Not exactly part of your presentation, yet possibly lingering in the back somewhere. Do you have any knowledge or any opinion on what many people still refer to as the crypto-Christians of Asia Minor?
So the question was about crypto-Christians in Asia Minor. Yeah, there's a wonderful book called My Grandmother. It was written by a Turkish human rights lawyer who discovered in her past that she thought she had, the clues didn't have, like her grandmother didn't fit in with everybody, right? Like she had different habits. I mean, she was a Muslim. She was, she did everything she was supposed to do, but she's like, this woman does not fit with the rest of the women around me. And so she started to unravel her grandmother's history and discovered that she had an Armenian grandmother. So here's this Turkish lawyer who says, this is my past. And because so many young women were taken and put into these Muslim households and converted, a lot of there are these crypto-Christians that sort of live there. Now, this woman her grandmother didn't live as a crypto-Christian because she is assimilated. But the question of the crypto-Christians is one that is sort of being uncovered now. In 1930, the Turkish state issues an order that they try to expel all the remaining Christian minorities. And we know this because when they expel them, on their travel documents is stamped not allowed to return. So this idea of right of return. So they have this on their documents. So Kemal tries to finish the game, or the Turkish state tries to finish the game of ridding Anatolia or the new Turkish state in 1930. So there have been all these efforts to get rid of these folks that are perceived as either crypto-Christians or they have some sort of connection that is not, they don't identify as Islamic. So crypto-Christians are in a really difficult position because if you identify yourself in any way, you are under this long history of expulsion. If you assimilate, people can still kind of tell that you might not fit in. So it becomes a very difficult story. And I was just in Greece in December for the first time, and I met a woman who's Turkish, who is a historian of this period of refugees. And she herself claimed, she says, I think I have Armenian ancestry. So there's this way that it's, even if you don't, there's this shadow that sits over modern Turkey of this group of people who had once been integrated, who are now considered, they can speak about them, but it's a very difficult time. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but they're in a very complicated place.
Do they still exist?
Well, some say they do. Some say they do. There was a great article in the New Yorker a few years back about one who was tending some. I can't remember who wrote it, but if you Google it, but he was a crypto-Christian in one of the eastern provinces, and it was a beautiful sort of story about him existing. So I think they do, but
it's difficult to tell if they could. Let me make a very quick comment on this. There was a Turkish journalist who had left Turkey because she was writing against the Erdogan regime and so on and so on. And on Facebook, she had written that in Turkey is not allowed to have a DNA analysis because they are afraid that many they will discover that they have
all of them.
Greek blood,
Many.
Syrian blood, or Armenian blood, and so on. Do you know anything about that?
It sounds believable. I mean, because it is very undermining to the story of the Turkish state, the Turkish nation. Absolutely.
That's please. Yeah.
I have a question, double question. First of all, today is the 19th of May, which is a date which Pondian Greeks, from the Black Sea, like me, double refugee, I was thrown out, one country to another one, my family did. It has anything to do with today's lecture, or it's like a coincidence that date, which is for the genocide, which I call the forgotten genocide of Pondian Greeks, because nobody gives a damn about this, anymore, especially like the major Greek newspaper, it's called the National Herald, has nothing about this, has a big advertising about other things. I have many, and of course I read an article about that Armenian lady, in this national thing. So today we celebrate, we Pondian people. I don't know how about Greek people from Peloponnesus, from other parts, but we celebrate. My son wrote a book about this today, this day. Wrote a book called Black Sea Lives Matter. It's a 500 pages book about my ancestors, which come from Asia Minor, and then went through the genocide, through the exchange of population. I think this treaty and the treatment we Greek people had from the big powers, Hitler learned a lot from Kemal Pasha, from all these things, especially when Turkish people, our women, they were marking like Hitler was marking, Auschwitz, with the tattoos, Greek, Pondian, Assyrian, Armenian people from the Black Sea, also the Gypsies, and also the Jews, so-called Romaniotti Jews thing. It's a very important date in our history, my history. I used to live in Poland. I was a refugee. My father was a refugee from Greece. He was thrown out of Greece after the domestic war, and I was thrown out of Poland. I came to America to make money, and I celebrate, I'm 50 years here, So the question was, is that any connection with this date?
I would respond to that. Yes, this lecture was in connection to that. Tom is family from Pontus, and he's a member of the board,
and Mavropoulos, Mr. Mavropoulos.
The book, the Cyrenian book. There is a book that connects this. So what genocide studies is doing now is much more. When I say Armenian genocide, we're much more thinking more broadly about. So this is a book that was published on this very topic that you're talking about, and how we can connect these stories. The Cyrenian book, really, and what my work attempts to do is to understand how this story.
My son wrote. This is Black Sea Lives Matter, and we went to the church before we came here. There's few people cried about this one, but our generation, my son wrote this book for his son. He's 9 years old. His name is Andrei Nikokiris. He plays electric guitar, and he celebrates 19th of May today, like me, like other people. Thank you.
Thank you very much for bringing to our attention. Thank you. The next question, please. Yes, please.
Okay. Costa, I have 3 brief questions, but I'll ask one, and I hope you will let me ask the others later.
Okay.
There was a considerable Jewish population in the Ottoman Empire. Did anything like this happen to them? And if not, why? Is it because they were considered non-threatening or even useful? Or also, did Jewish organizations have some influence in a number of Western capitals, especially London?
So the question of no, the Jewish population is not included in this.
Right.
They very much are considered. They were integrated into the Ottoman Empire in ways that Christian minorities were not.
Mm-hmm.
It is interesting, though, in the late 19th century, in the Treaty of Berlin, when the European foreign powers are talking about protection of minorities in the Ottoman Empire, Jews are included in that group. So it's Jews and so there is a sense of the Ottoman. Hang on a second. There is a sense in the Ottoman Empire that the Jews are a minority, but they are not a minority that are caught up in this story, and they aren't really they aren't targeted in this story. Explanations are, I think that the Armenians and the Greeks were a much larger population. They were the millet system was very much tied to the way Ottoman Christians were governed themselves, and so these villages. Especially around these borders and these areas, the Turkish government started to see them as very threatening populations in a way that Jews were not seen in that way. So they are not part of the story. But in the 19th century, there is a worry that they are categorized in the mind of Europeans as minorities as well. Does that help?
Can I say something about this?
Later on, if I have the chance others to ask questions, then I will give you the opportunity. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much for a very enlightening lecture. a lot of the events that you talk about today were preceded by what was the defeat of the Greek army going toward Ankara, pushing toward Ankara, became very close to seizing it. What was the strategic goal of the Greek army, and relying on your expertise as a military expert? What was the strategic goal there?
I'm still getting used to being called a military historian. I was at Berkeley, started as a cultural historian, and the idea that now I'm categorized as a military historian I still have to, but it's true. Yeah, I mean, the military story is so crucial because it connects with the humanitarian story. So it's the Magali idea, right? The idea that the Greek is they're going to unite all of the Greeks together. And 1922 is the death of that idea. Now, why they're pushing towards Ankara is because they're being encouraged by the British government to move. They're not helping them with military. The British government is not helping them, but they are encouraging the Greek army's movements. But because of instability that happens in the fall of 1922 in the Greek government, the army cannot maintain itself. And because the Allies refuse to dedicate manpower to it, the Greeks can't stop. There's also Chanak, which I did not talk about here. The defeat of the Allies at Chanak. There's a set. Yes, they are trying. They basically are. They're staring at each other on each side of the border. The Allies are on one side. The British army is there, and the Kemalist army is on the other side. And they're waiting. They're staring at each other to see if they're going to start this attack again. Now they back down. And they don't come to blows at Chanak. But that could have been a moment where the Greek army is then bolstered because of this action. One of the most fascinating things about that moment is, I mean, people say, oh, well, Smyrna was an accident, they debate. But Kemal himself, when it was time to have the peace conference, he says, let's have it at Smyrna, after he'd burned the entire place to the ground. So the idea here is that Kemal is using fire as a tactic of terror, and he's using this threat that at Chanak, the Turkish military, that army is going to then attack the Allies. And if you're a British politician like Lloyd George, the election's coming up. The idea that the British army is involved in another full-scale military confrontation. So when Lloyd George is pushed out of government in 1922, they call it his Greek disaster. That's how they talk about it. So I think to understand what's happening with the Greek army, you have to understand what's happening with the British army and the Allies at Chanak and Smyrna. So I think they're all integrated.
Did that event that the British could not finish their job in Turkey have an effect on the election in Great Britain?
Well, yeah, I mean, it really did, because Lloyd George is pushed from power. So the Liberals, actually, Lloyd George is the last Liberal prime minister, Liberal with a capital L, the Liberal Party. There are no more Liberal prime ministers after Lloyd George. It's the death of a party after this. And it goes back to Gladstone and the ideas about protection of Christian minorities. So that whole strand of thinking in European politics that Britain is the protector of Christian minorities just really dies on that day. So yeah, absolutely, it affects that story. And then Bonner Law, who comes in after that, is like, we don't really want to do that. We're going to risk just, and he doesn't even want to go to war over Mesopotamia. He's like, there's oil there, but I don't really even want to go to war over that. It's just, there's a real sense of disengagement in the 1920s because this war has been so devastating. So absolutely devastating in Europe. And the Europeans don't want to fight it anymore. And the Americans never declare war on the Ottoman Empire. So you can't rely on the Americans to come in as the force. So there, I guess I'm a military historian.
Any other first question? Oh, please go ahead.
Okay, Nick Petros, coming back to that question about the Jews, Christian Greeks during the Ottoman Empire were the third tier of citizens. Turkish was number one. Number two was the Jews. I don't know what was the thing. Probably all the Jews came from the Sephardic Jews. They migrated to Turkey. They were in Thessaloniki, and Istanbul and everywhere else. So that the Jews were treated better than our thing. We were the third. If in the court a Greek guy did something to a Jew, the Jew will win the court because he was protected by the Ottoman Empire thing. And all those. We had army people. Of course, the story about the Smyrni, it's tragic. The story about the Turkish Greek and Turkish war, it was a lot of mistakes Greek politicians made. They went too far. They wanted to go. Britain, and all the big powers never helped us. Greeks, never helped us. They were busy colonizing, Cyprus, doing the Mesopotamia. Yeah, you said the Mesopotamia, that's all they did. Maybe it was a liberal British thing. They're not our friends. I went to a lecture about Lord Byron, another lecture, and British people don't celebrate the 200 years of Lord Byron, completely not. Only we are celebrating Lord Byron as our national hero and big revolutionary. He wasn't, a revolutionary. Just he donated a few dollars to the revolution. It's not enough. He was busy chasing other guys, because he was gay. Yeah, that's true.
Okay, let's give the opportunity to other social to ask what? Excuse me, let's give the opportunity to other social
Yes.
I am.
Yeah, please.
Just a minor comment regarding how the Jews had more privilege. I think it ties to that. They were seen as monotheistic, and they never realized the Christians as monotheistic based on how we believe our Trinity. So I just wanted to add that.
Yes, please.
I wanted to go back to your comments about the Treaty of Lausanne changing the events that came thereafter. Could you expand on that a little bit? We've had 100 years.
Yeah.
What are the most important milestones in those 100 years that spring from this?
That's a great question. I am a historian of World War I, so I'm kind of spitballing here, right? So, but what the way I see it is its effect on minority policy. The idea that somehow you can engineer this idea that you can draw these borders and you can compel people to sort of move across them. So that is enshrined in international law for the first time, that compulsory exchange of populations, which feels like a euphemism, right? You can force people to move because they're on the wrong side of the border. That, I think, continues to stay with us. And after World War II, you see that invoked again with how do you get people on the right side? And that is a power in international law, or that is recognized, is definitely part of Lausanne. The other thing about Lausanne that's really important, I think, is its idea that, it really is still in effect. It is the only treaty that's still in effect after World War I. And there's about 140 islands that 150 islands in the Aegean that Turkey is trying to claim, right? That Greece was given as part of the treaty. So I think the question about Lausanne's keeping the peace between Greece and Turkey, I'll tell you an anecdotal story. So I've talked to a couple of different Greek audiences, and the Greek consul has introduced me at both times, and these other two. And the official position of the Greek consul is this is a good treaty. We need to maintain this treaty. And I remember the first time I did this, I thought, oh no, I'm going to get up there and say it was a terrible treaty. Like, how is this going to work out, right? But it didn't seem to bother anybody, because there's this sense like it's a live treaty and it's a live issue. So when Erdogan starts saying things like, we're going to tear it up, it makes everybody really nervous, because what are you going to do? So I think Lausanne as a live treaty, that's its legacy in so many ways, is what's going to happen with those borderlands and what's going to happen with Greco-Turkish relations. Now, we know Greco-Turkish relations have been terrible periodically, right? It's in a rough spot right now. And I think it's because this treaty gets to be the focus of that for the first time. So I think it's the liveness of the treaty and its effect on refugees.
Ο Χρήστος και μετά ο Θανάσης. Thank you very much for a very nice talk. Some sources have suggested that all ships stayed neutral except for one, the Japanese. And apparently people on that ship threw all the loads where they had into the sea so that they could get refugees.
So the question of the Japanese ship, I've heard this, and I can't really add too much to it other than I know they were there. And the strict orders of neutrality question is really, I think it's really an important one. And I wish I could find that order that said when it changed and who gave the order to change it, because apparently when it changed for the British, it changed for everybody. Like it became a massive evacuation effort. And I would sure like to know how the Japanese, what their role was, because it does seem to be something that was on the spot. Like it was unconscionable when you, so these interviews that I cited, they're all in the Imperial War Museum in London. And when you read them and you kind of hear their voices, some of them are actually recorded, so you can actually hear their voices talking about it. You could just imagine how you are told to not do anything as you watch Murders in Broad Daylight, right? Like you just like that thing. But the order seems to have been tossed out with the paper drives of World War II. They were doing paper drives and they were tearing out archives and they were disappeared somehow. So the Japanese story, I think, would be illuminating to figure out why they did that, and maybe they exist in the Japanese archives. I don't know, but I have heard that, and I can't add much more to it.
Athanasius, and then we will go here. Yes, please.
As you know, Erdogan is threatening and there's people coming on what exactly stipulates the agreement that gives Erdogan
so there's a couple of things happening. So the question is, what does the Lausanne Treaty say about the islands? And why does Erdogan where is he getting this from, right? There's a couple of ways to think about this. So one is there's this rumor being spread amongst Turkish. I actually got an email from someone who said that they were Turkish students who wanted to know if there were secret clauses in the Lausanne Treaty, and I would not reply to it because I don't know if they're actually students who are. I mean, I might be. I'm probably on some list somewhere. but that there's these secret clauses nullify the treaty. So that there are these secret, and that that Turkey needs to renegotiate because these secret clauses have been hamstringing Turkey really based on because of these islands. So a couple of things have happened. There are no secret clauses. That's just rumor. But the islands themselves, because they were ceded to Greece, right? Greece then militarized these islands in the wake of Cyprus. And Turkey said, you don't have any right to do that. So they think that it's illegitimate for Lausanne, right? So, well, the question of militarizing these islands is the question. But what happened, as I understand it, again, I'm a historian. I'm not, as I understand it, what's happened in that agreement is that those islands have been understood as Turkey can do what it wants with them. So Greece can do what it wants with them. So Greece took its case to the international community to be adjudicated, and they said, well, yeah, you can do that. Well, Turkey says, no, that's illegitimate. You've got to demilitarize these. But of course, what does Greece say? Well, we remember Cyprus, right?
Well, the Greek experts on this, they say that the Turks have no say about what happened to the islands, because what happened to the islands, it was done by the allies and not by the Turks. So the Turks, they are not part of what is going to happen to the islands. It's not part of the negotiation between the allies and Turkey. The allies decided the islands to go to Greece. And as regards the demilitarization, it was requested by the allies. But the allies today, they are not bothered by it. So the Greeks, they say, if the allies who they ceded the islands to the Greeks, they are not bothered by it, then Turkey has no say into it, because they were not part of the agreement that.
It's not a bilateral agreement.
Yeah.
So Turkey and Greece are treating Lausanne as a bilateral agreement. It's not. So the idea, if you're going to throw Lausanne out, you've got to, I mean, it's enshrined in international law, right? I mean, you got to have another conference. You got to invite everybody, all this, because all the signatories, it wasn't just Greece and Turkey. Now, the hard thing with Lausanne is that it is keeping the peace between Turkey and Greece right now. So it does feel like a bilateral agreement, but we can't forget, we can't treat it like one, because otherwise it undermines these other elements that we were talking about refugees and about, you know, these other, it's not just that story. So if you're going to renegotiate the island thing, you got to open up the treaty. That's Greece's argument.
But if it be negotiated, the allies, they have to agree to that, because the allies, they're the ones who decided to give the islands to Greece.
And that's what Greece is saying.
Exactly. That's what the Greek experts, they say. Turkey had no say into it. Turkey did not say if they agree or not. They did not even ask them. The allies, they did not ask the Turks what's going to happen to the islands. The allies, actually the islands, they were under the control of the Italians. So at the time. So the allies decided, the Italians decided the islands to go to the Greeks. It was not part of the negotiation for the treaty between the allies and the Turks. So since the Turks, they were not part of this exchange of the islands, they have no say into it. As long as the ones who ceded the islands to the Greeks, they are not bothered by it. So if the Italians are not bothered, the British are not bothered, we have no say. That's what the Greek experts say. Yes, I will take you a bit later, but here is something like that. There is a question here for the first time. Please, do you have your question? Please, right.
What I'm thinking is, of course,
I'm sorry. I thought the back, and then I would do. Yeah, let's have the guy first.
Does this treaty cover the Dardanelles and the access to the Black Sea?
So that was all renegotiated. And in fact, Russia is brought in briefly to talk about the Dardanelles. But it covers that.
And is there a law international that says that these agreements are only in effect for 100 years?
No.
And they're not in effect.
As far as, no, yeah.
Maria.
One is that the Turks challenged the Treaty of Lausanne because of the islands. The other thing is that Erdogan is sending Muslims to the islands. Then you say the majority of the population is Muslim. So, I mean, kind of religion. Later they will say after they challenge the Treaty of Lausanne, oh, most of the population, so that they belong to us. I don't know if this is a kind of their thinking.
So the issue of Muslim migration to these islands. Yeah, I mean, I don't know much about that how that's working, but if you think about it,
it's not true. There are no Turks migrating to the Greek islands. It happens in Cyprus, where they send lots of Turks population in northern Cyprus. That's true, but not in the Greek islands.
Well, and
the Turks who they left for Greece are the ones who Erdogan considers that they were against him, and he want to take them to his own justice system, etc.
Let the speaker speak.
Excuse me?
Let the speaker answer.
Yeah, but I know about that issue, so this is not no, do you have a different
I was going to go back to your issue about Lausanne's legacies. The idea that you should have possession over a particular area because a certain group lives there. Lausanne gives us that idea, right? That notion that a nation, that if more of your people are there, that's yours, right? And I think there's a psychic element to the Lausanne Treaty. This idea that nations belong with particular, like belongs with like. This idea of multi-ethnic, multi-religious empires. I think Lausanne's psychological effect and reality, the reality of the exchange makes us worry about things like well, who cares who lives if there's more Muslims, right? This is under so-and-so's, this is under so-and-so's dominion. It's the national solution that gets codified in international law in a way that we really can't go back.
Which thing happened in India and now Pakistan.
Yeah.
Because most of the population in the area were Muslims. Now they separate part of India.
That's a population exchange. So the biggest civilian relocation in history, 15 million people moved, happens in 1947. And why is that possible? Because of Lausanne. They're forced to move. They literally are told they have to switch places.
Yeah, 1947, it's also the time of the Greek domestic war, which civil war, which is a very important part of the Greek culture, because many people thrown out from the Black Sea part, the Pondian people that celebrate today. One more time, I like to say to everybody, hello, it's.
I think you should say commemorate rather than celebrate.
What?
I think you should say commemorate rather than celebrate.
Yeah.
Okay, let's put some order because otherwise everybody's going to talk. So please. Yes, at the back there.
I just wanted to make a brief comment about the Jackson question that you spoke presented. I was an original member with the Asia Minor Pontus Hellenic Research Center, and years ago, Dimitri is also on the board. We had an event, and several of you were probably there, where we recognized the contributions of the Japanese. We have the Consul General Office represented. We had the Japanese newspaper. There was no research that they could uncover with respect to the archives, the name of the ship, none of that. It's just the brief reference that a humanitarian gesture, they talked about all the cargo when they witnessed it, very dramatically because it was the right thing and instinctually to do. And then they saved the refugees. I didn't do the research, but to my understanding, we tried to get as much information. So that's all we knew.
Thank you. That's good to know. Thank you.
If I can add, the Detroit-born Greek-American labor historian Dan Georgiakis wrote that his family was from the Smyrna area. And according to his family, the Japanese were the people who rescued. That's all I'm going to add.
Okay.
Referring back to your statement that Lausanne is still a living treaty, there's been amendments to that treaty over the years. For example, the Italian, the Legacies Islands that have been granted, that the Italians have been granted sovereignty over the Legacies. Those were then, after World War II, given to the Greeks. Is that a reason, or could that be considered the fact that there have been amendmts to that treaty? Why Erdogan has now the ability to talk like he does?
Well, you can amend treaties. That's absolutely true. It's not the language he's using that we're going to amend the treaty. I think he's using it very much as a nationalist ploy to show Turkish power in the region. We also have to think about Russia right now, right? Russia and the war in Ukraine. Who is the player who has most to gain by Russia's lack of influence in this region? It's Turkey, right? So he started this rhetoric in 2016. I think he can step it up. So I guess the answer to the question is, I don't think he's thinking, oh, well, look, we can amend it because it's been amended. Like, I don't think there's a legalistic view. I think he's using it to increase a sense of, I think they're idle threats because the international community is not going to allow that. And if he wanted an amendment, he could call for an amendment. He's talking about tearing it up, right? I think we have to understand, listen to what his rhetoric is, because he could say, well, let's amend it because we want these 10 islands because they, that's not what he's saying. So to tear up the Lausanne Treaty is a sort of dramatic gesture that I think we're going to hear more of it, because I think with the weakness of Russia in the region now, and whatever you think of the war, the terrible war in Ukraine, what it has done is it has diminished the Russian ability to keep the lid on ethnic and regional nationalism in the case of Armenia and Azerbaijan. We were talking about that yesterday. And I think the player with the most to gain is Turkey. Mm-hmm. So I would not be surprised if you start hearing more about, oh, it's time for us to exert ourselves and expand our power. That might be the way he's going to do it. So I see it as a nationalist ploy rather than someone who's thinking, oh, well, let's do this from a legalistic way. We really just want these things. I think they want the whole thing.
Yes, we have a question from Costa, who's following on online. How is the burning of Smyrna and the Greek genocide commemorated in Greece?
That's a good question. I mean, at this conference I went to in Kalamata on last December. It's a very difficult story because of contemporary Turkish-Greek politics. So the idea of commemoration, I don't know the answer because I was not there. I haven't been there for a commemoration. But I think an analogous story might be how Armenians commemorate the Armenian genocide in Armenia very carefully, right? Very carefully. And when you go to the Acropolis Museum, there's all this stuff about the British returning the Elgin marbles, right? All of that stuff. No one talks about the Turks blowing it up. No one talks about Turkey's it's almost invisible in all of the antagonism in the narratives are not there with Turkey. And I think it has to do with contemporary politics because the experience with diaspora populations is why doesn't the National Party stand up for us in the face of the Turks, right? But the reality is in that region, you gotta have peace, right? You gotta be able to get along with your neighbors. And if the Greeks are going on about the genocide, it has real ramifications for Erdogan's rhetoric. And I don't want to say they're operating out of fear, but there is a real pragmatism that I think as diaspora populations have to understand. I know in the Armenian community, it's very why doesn't Armenia stand up to this? It's well, they're a landlocked country that relies on their neighbors to be able to survive. So I think there's an interesting tension between commemorations outside of the mother country, outside of Greece, right? And inside, and there's a delicate balance. And I heard that with Greek scholars who were talking about this in December. I don't want to say there was a hesitancy, but there's definitely there's a pragmatism. Maybe a pragmatism is the best way to put it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Just a comment. When Asa Jennings took on and helped evacuate a lot of people, was that done? Did he break the rules, or was it after they started all
Article 5.
Know that is the WCA.
So what's interesting, and one of the things I argue in the book is that to understand the humanitarian activism, you have to understand the military part. We often think of military and humanitarian as separate, but actually they're overlapping concerns. So the only reason that any humanitarian work is able to be done is because they have the consent and the support of the military. You saw all those sailors doing that evacuation. They are working in concert with the humanitarians, not always consciously and overlapping, but they have to necessarily rely on each other. And it's very strange when the military and humanitarian activists, they make very strange bedfellows, right? Because the military has particular aims and the humanitarians have particular aims, but the humanitarians need the military for security, right? And the military need the humanitarians to help them. I mean, I hate to say it, but to get the civilians out of the way. I mean, it really, the concentration camp is invented as a humanitarian institution in World War I, when the Allies are invading Mesopotamia and they need to get the civilians out of the way. They create these camps, these refugee camps that were former killing camps. The Ottoman Empire was using them. They create these camps to get the civilians out. But who's running them? Well, the military is running them, but they're also being engaged with these humanitarian organizations. So I think we have to understand those things are happening. They're overlapping. They don't always have the same aims, but they have to rely on each other. And it makes for very strange, very strange bedfellows. They really do, but they are absolutely integrated. And I don't know that story specifically how the military works, but it is happening simultaneously.
Why? Hold on a second. Why was there a small Turkish Muslim minority to be in Greece, and a small Greek Christian minority to be in Turkey after the Treaty of Lausanne.
Oh, in Constantinople.
Yes.
Okay, so that's the agreement. You know, your question about crypto Christians is interesting, because if you just look at Istanbul today, that's a place where they're allowed to be, right? After the 1950s, they had the riots, and they had the terrible the pogroms, yeah. But the communities that exist there still exist in communal. They're communal, right? So that was also, they allowed the patriarch to stay in Constantinople. So that was an agreement. That was just part of the treaty. They decided that was going to be part of that. And I have a very a good colleague who's at MIT who does work, and she has a Turkish last name, but she's Armenian. She's from Constantinople, and so, or Istanbul. So, you know, there's they live a life that is there's some great books about this, about it, the Armenians, at least the Armenian identity. And I'm sure there's some stuff about the Greeks and how you live in a community where you can technically practice your religion, you can go to schools, you can do that stuff, but you are always seen as somehow a guest, you know.
Right.
You're just lucky that but the treaty does allow that population.
And so the Turks and Greece were to balance the Greek Christians in Istanbul.
So one of the things that they're also fighting about, we're talking about the islands, but one of the things Erdogan and others are fighting about is the treatment of Muslim minorities in Greece and Christian minorities in Turkey, right? So I just know the Muslim story. So in Greece, so it's the only place in Europe where a population is governed by Sharia law. In Greece, because they are allowed to have their own courts. The Muslim minority is allowed to have their own courts in Greece, but the Greek government picks the muftis, right? They pick that group, and that's one of the controversies. Is, well, why can't the community pick them? Not should we get rid of this system? So that's the second part of the renegotiating of Lausanne that they're trying to think about, the treatment of minorities in both sections.
But there are almost no Greeks left in Turkey now. That's all I wanted to say.
That's the thing with genocide, is it works.
Yes.
It works.
Exactly.
No Jews in Germany, no Christians in, I mean, that's the project, right? Exactly. And the project is engaged with on both sides. Like the allies helped promote this project by doing the exchange, and Kamal they are able to finish the job by 19.
Please, I understand.
Well, this guy spoke 3 times. I spoke only 2. I spoke only 2 times.
My clock time, you're way ahead of me.
That's because I'm Pontian, you know.
Please.
Mr. Erdogan made a statement. We expel those who occupied our country.
Oh.
This is what he said. So crazy. We should say that, not him.
So it's a question, not a comment.
I mean, why he says that? I mean, there's no.
Well, you cannot impose it on
another thing is why he speaks against the Jews since the Mossad was trained by me in Turkish territory, not. He speaks with this Gaza problem. He speaks against the Jews, correct? He does.
Yes, I think.
Will you repeat that?
So,
I don't know.
Erdogan's relationship to the Jewish question. Yeah, I can't really speak. I can't really add anything more to. I'm not. Yeah, he has met. He's using again. I think I go back to this idea. He's jockeying for a position as the key player in the region, the key power player. So this Gaza question is really important for him.
Okay, I will take 3 more questions and then we are going to close the session. Panos has not asked a question, so he has priority.
I want to lower the expertise level of the discussion and ask you a very naive question. Visualizing modern Turkey, I have had some exchange students. And all these years, obviously, I was thinking of Turkey as an Ottoman country. The exchange student was referring to, the Ottoman Turks, as if they were just a new minority. So my question for going back to the basics, how do I visualize Turkey? What percent are they Ottoman and what percent are they Mideast Caucasian?
So the composition of modern Turkey. So the Ottomans, this is, so multi-ethnic, multi-confessional empires are not based on ethnicity. So they're not like, Turks were considered yokels. They were considered country bumpkins. Like there was not, like the Ottoman, during the Ottoman Empire, they were not considered the ruling class. It was a multi-ethnic, multi-religious ruling elite. I mean, you know, you had your Armenian potter, you know, who made all the dishes for they still exist in Jerusalem, right, in this world. And you had your people that did things, and it wasn't based on ethnicity or religion. So to say Ottoman Turk was to be an Ottoman was not necessarily to be a Turk, like a Muslim Turk, right? So when the Ottoman Empire falls, right, they fall to a nationalist, I keep using the word nationalist, the new ideology of nation that comes out of this is not an imperial one where you have these multi-ethnic, multi-confessional empires, but rather ones based on identity, and that identity is primarily, in the case of Turkey, religious. So you're Muslim or you're non-Muslim, and then it becomes identified as Turkic. So the Kurds are a great example of this, right? The Kurds are Muslim, right? But they are considered outsiders because they have a nationalist movement that sees them as separate from the main group. So they should be folded in by this logic, but they are understood as a minority that are threatening to the Turkish state. So nation evolves this idea of an Ottoman, because an Ottoman is not necessarily a Turk, right? And an Ottoman isn't necessarily Muslim, and that's kind of a hard way to sort of think about it. But when the empires die off after World War I or removed from nation, then we get the story where it's you are a particular kind of nationality and or a particular kind of ethnic identity or religion, and you live in this boundary area. That's the logic of nation state.
So it makes no sense to think what percent are they Asiatic and what percent are they European. It doesn't matter.
It's very yeah, right.
Yeah. Okay. Tommy, then you will have the last one.
Okay. Well, this is yes. This is the question. Let me 1 second. This is the question from Stefanos Sakelaridis. Was there ever a Lausanne-like solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict?
You mean like a population exchange? So what happens with Palestine?
Back to Turkey.
I'm sorry, you're talking so the like in terms of population change.
Was a Lausanne-like agreement ever considered on the Israel-Palestine issue?
So what happens with Palestine? Palestine becomes a mandate. So the Ottoman Empire, the Allies in 1917, they blow through what was today the Middle East, and they knock Turkey out of the war. 1918, they force them to come to the table. And the Allies, particularly the British and the French, claim that territory as what they call mandates. Mm-hmm. So there's the Palestine mandate, there's the Mesopotamia mandate, there's the Syrian mandate. So France gets Syria, right? Britain gets Palestine, right? But the idea of a mandate is not that it's a colony, but it's this sort of in-between state mm-hmm. that Britain will eventually let it go, and it will become a self-governing state. Now, what happens as a result, because of the Balfour Declaration of 1917, what happens is the Balfour Declaration promises a homeland for Jews in Palestine with respect to minority community rights, but they don't mention the Arabs at all. The Arabs had sided with the Allies during World War I and thought that they were going to get that territory. Mm-hmm. So what happens is that immigration is encouraged from Jewish immigration is encouraged. They're a very small minority in Palestine. If you say this to anyone who lives in Israel today, they'll say, no way, you know, but the reality is very small population of Jews in Palestine in this period. But that immigration is encouraged by the British and supported, and the Palestine Mandate becomes one where it it is that Jewish immigration to this region is very much encouraged. There's no population exchange. There's no exchange, but you do get an influx of immigration that creates Jewish enclaves in Palestine after World War I, that of course the Holocaust will then accelerate that immigration settlement patterns. So there's no Lausanne, but there's a colonial story that has to do with the British Empire encouraging immigration. And just to give a context, when the French get Syria as a mandate, they create it as a homeland for the Christians who don't have a homeland. And they create a sizable Christian minority there, and they encourage, that's why there are so many Armenians in Beirut, right? That, at least before the Civil War. So they encourage that, and they create these own sort of nation states. Now, of course, for the Arab population, they don't like this idea that these groups of refugees are being settled in regions, and the humanitarians create these villages, and the villages that are created with Western money are often named after the villages that were destroyed in the war or taken over by Turkey. So they have the Armenian word for new is Nur. So it'd be like Nurmush, like the new city. How would you feel if you were an Arab in these territories? So it's about settlement and about encouraging settlement. And it's not just in Palestine, but it's in Syria. It's in what we would call Lebanon. And those mandates exist well after.
Okay, the last one.
Thank you.
Question, not lecture. Question, not lecture.
Okay, she wants to say.
Are you allergic to elections, or why you came here? One more question. I lived in this country for 50 years, and I came up to the day today, the 19th of May, where my president, Joe Biden, is called by the people from the universities the genocide Joe. These people forget the other genocide Joe was Joseph Stalin, genocide Erdogan, he's and genocide Adolf Hitler. That's what I want to close, That's why I don't agree with any universities in America. You work in a university, right? You're a professor. Okay, explain to me why the students, carry all those things to the people. It's an insult to the people they went through the genocide, like the Greeks, which is, one more time, I repeat, it's forgotten genocide. Nobody talks about. We treat.
You should read my book.
You should read my book.
Okay, very good.
All right.